And thank you, Adam. I want to welcome you to our workshop. Hopefully, there's been lots of good information so far today. Hopefully, we still have a little bit more in the tank. We're ready to absorb just a little bit more. The purpose and the focus of our workshops this afternoon is so that we can walk out of here today with a tangible plan. So in getting prepared for this workshop, one of the things I was doing, I was talking to different people about what are their pet peeves. We all have pet peeves. And I just kind of wanted to get a feeling, what are things that really annoy people? I got a lot of traffic-related ones. Apparently, not all of us are very patient drivers. One of my favorites is when you're driving down the road and you got this person driving down the road in front of you with a blinker on for 20 miles. It's like, okay. And then the other extreme, of course, you got the person who's just stops suddenly and makes a turn right in front of you and never did blink. It's like, do anybody know what these things are even for? Cell phones going off in church, apparently that bothers some people. So I've heard. But one of my pet peeves is over the years, I've been to a lot of these different conferences. We come together as Christians. We have really gifted talkers, and they'll give you lots of good information. You absorb this information, and some of them are very good at getting you hyped up and excited about it. You're thinking, yeah, that's really, really great. But then you have no idea what you're supposed to do with it. So you leave the place and you're thinking, well, that was good information. Maybe it was too much information, but I have no plan with it. And it goes something like this. They'll come out and say, here's so-and-so person in a Bible, and they were a sinner, and it was really, really bad, and don't be like them. Oh, okay, thanks. I'm going to go home and change absolutely nothing about my life right now. It wasn't very helpful. So today, what they wanted to do, and what Adam asked us to do with these workshops, is define things that we can do practically. What are the actual steps that we can take when we leave here to put these things into our lives and to start changing things for the better? Well, let's start by talking about what we mean about spiritual disciplines. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul's talking about discipline. He says, do you not know that in a race, all the runners run, but only one receives a prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly as one who just boxes and beats the air, but I discipline my body, and I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. When we think of an elite athlete, whether they're training for the Olympics or whatever it is they're getting ready for, a marathon, they get very, very focused in their lives. This isn't just, I'm going to go out and run once a week, or I'm going to spend a few hours in the gym. But there's every aspect of their lives that they're going to pour into trying to obtain this prize, trying to obtain this reward that they really desire. And they're going to be so focused on it that they're going to change their diet. They're going to change their sleeping habits. They're going to change their regimen. Their entertainment is even going to be affected. They're not going to go out spending time partying and drinking with friends, because they know if they start doing these things, if they start compromising in all these areas, what's going to end up happening? They're going to get to the competition. Somebody who didn't do that is going to beat them. And they're going to be standing there looking at the people who are up on the podium after. And Paul uses this analogy in a very powerful way to talk about us as their spiritual walk. They're doing this for a gold medal that will one day perish, but us for an eternal reward. We're collecting rewards here in heaven or on earth that we'll be enjoying in heaven from here to eternity. So they work hard for these things. But when we're looking at spiritual disciplines, we're not talking about just a few areas in our lives. Apostle Paul says, I exercise self-control in all things. So this is kind of the total man part of it. This is where we're going to take self-control. Oh, I'm going to get just this one area right, and then I'm going to be doing okay, and I can slack off in other areas. Or if I do this, then I'm okay here, because it kind of balances itself out. But we're building ourselves as men in a complete way. And that means spirit, soul, and body. That means the physical part of us. That means our mental state. And that means our spiritual state as well. So spiritual disciplines themselves. We've touched on a few of these today, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on each of them because I want to really get into the practical application side of these. But some of these positive things that we're talking about here are things that we've talked about. But before we get into that, let's talk about the things that they're not. Sometimes we can get to a point where we fool ourselves into believing things are spiritual when they may not necessarily be. I've had a guy talk to me before and he says, I feel the most spiritual when I am out in nature. I mean, it's just God and me, and we're in nature and on a golf course Sunday mornings. It's like, yeah, okay, no. Golf course Sunday mornings, or they're out in a tree stand and, I'm going to blow off church because, oh man, I'm just so close to God at that time. And you can insert whatever it is you enjoy there, whether it's an exercise program. It could be time out in nature. It could be time doing gardening, things around the house, chores, menial tasks. And don't get me wrong, all these things can become more spiritual if we're going to include God into them. But we have to be careful that when we get outside of what is modeled in Scripture as a spiritual discipline, then we're just deceiving ourselves. Now we're taking on things that aren't spiritual at all, and we're just going to replace what God has told us to do. How do we end up doing that? Well, one of the things is, these things, and again, I don't want to take away from that. Our goal is to include God in every area of our life. We can get to that. If we're going to take some time to take a shower and we're going to pray, or if we're driving and we're taking time spending with some worship music on, we're worshiping God, those are all great things, but they're not replacements. So for us, whether we're just becoming a Christian, or whether it's something we've been doing a long time, we can add to these things. So the first one we're going to take a look at is prayer. Prayer, again, depends on what your vision is of it, can be a one-on-one time that we spend alone with God. Prayer is also a time that we spend together as a group, whether it's as a family praying around the table at dinner time, or whether it's time of prayer with your wife. It's also corporate prayer, time that we spend together maybe at a prayer meeting in a church, or with a discipleship group, with our life groups, or even in the corporate setting as we've been praying throughout the day. Bible reading. Bible reading is not just, I'm going to read the verse of the day and, I've done my Bible reading for the day. Well, Bible reading is not just time getting into the Word and getting to know it, but it's also time we spend studying it, trying to understand it, trying to know exactly what it means. What is it saying here? So these Bible studies that we can take on can expand from there. Another part of the study could be getting to memorization, meditation. These are things that we're adding to those spiritual disciplines. Fellowship is another one. Pastor Aaron often talks about no man is an island. It's not going to be just Jesus and me, and that's all I need. If it's just Jesus and me, I don't need everybody else. I don't need to be, in all these different groups. I don't need to be part of this. I don't have to share my heart with everybody. But that's not the way that God has created us. When we were saved, we were added to the church. And the church gives the analogy of the body. And each member of that body has a certain function. To function in that body, you have to be a part of it. There's no part of your body that says, I don't need the rest of the body. We need one another. And as men, we like to be strong. We like to be kind of masculine sometimes. We say we don't need people, but we do need one another. And even if you think you're strong enough that you don't need somebody else, well, maybe somebody needs you then. Some of the wisdom and the experiences that you went through, if you're cutting off the fellowship from other people, then they're not learning from that. They're not able to hear the things that you went through and be encouraged by the lessons that you've learned throughout your life. So fellowship is another one that's very important. It's something that we can, again, do in a group setting. A group like this today could be an example of that. Our life groups could be an example, men's groups that we get together with. Or it even could be one-on-one. We get together, we go out for coffee, and we're talking, we're just saying, hey, how you been doing? What are the things that you've been going and experiencing in your life? So these are the things that we want to be able to take advantage of as well. Fasting, probably the most neglected and probably the most underrated of all of them. Today, we've talked about different sins of passivity, and now Chris has talked about the sin of habitual sexual sin in our life. If this is an area where you have a problem, if this is an area that you struggle with over and over again, any of these habitual sins that are physical desires that we're trying to fight against, fasting is one of your best defenses. And the reason for it is people say, well, what do I need to fast? What does it even prove? Well, it proves that you're taking control over your body. You as a man are taking control of your mind, your body, and your spirit all at the same time. When your body is saying, hey, I'm hungry, I want to eat, and you're like, nope, not going to happen. You're taking control. You're learning to control your desires. And that desire and that craving is going to get stronger and stronger. It's going, dude, feed me. Like, I'm really hungry. I'm going to start getting hangry here. It's like, nope, not going to happen. And we're learning to control our lusts. We're learning to control our appetites. And if we can learn, even in a physical sense, just with food, which is something, as Chris had pointed out, we need, we'll die without it eventually. But if we can take control over that and start applying it to other areas of lives, that'll help us a lot when we're going through those struggles. When you're in that situation where that craving seems so strong and overwhelming, now you have something to pull off and say, no, I've experienced this. I'm going to live through this. I'll get through it. So when we fast, it's not just the physical side of that. Here comes the spiritual side too. Now we're fasting and praying. We're getting the blessings that come with it too. Because each time we get that distraction that's, man, I really want to eat right now. Nope. Instead of doing that, I'm going to spend some time in prayer. Man, I'm getting really, really hungry here. We haven't eaten for, so many hours. Nope. I think this is the time that we're going to go into a Bible study. And we start shifting that appetite to other things. So whether we're just starting out as Christians or whether we've been doing this for years, we have a wide variety of people in here. Some people are new at this and wondering, well, what does all this mean? And other people, we may have gotten into a point where we're complacent and we're, okay, I've been reading the Bible every day for however many years, but you never really change things up. You never really expand it. Complacency, believe it or not, can be more dangerous than not doing anything at all. And the reason being is because if we're not doing anything at all in our spiritual walk, if we're not doing anything to get ourselves closer to God, we realize that this deficit. We know, yeah, you know what? I got to get my act together and I got to start doing these things. But if we're doing a little bit, if we're doing it for a long time, but we're really not getting anything out of it, well, then we can become complacent. Not before we know it, we're starting to get into where the church of Laodiceans were. They're becoming lukewarm, where God says, you know what? You're not either hot nor cold, and I'm going to spew you out of my mouth. Why? Because they weren't aware of their deficit, and they weren't growing closer to God. As Christians, this is something that we have to realize. We're never going to attain. We're never going to reach that possession. We're always going to be moving forward. When I was a younger Christian, I remember talking to somebody who was much older, a senior citizen at the time, who had been a Christian their whole life. And they confessed, they said, you know what? I thought that by the time I got to this age, God would be pretty much finished with me. He's not. I still have so long to go. And you'll find for those who are younger, as the closer you get to God, the more you realize you have a long ways to go. For those who have been Christians for a long time, this is something you've probably already come to realize. The closer you get to God, the more you realize, wow, I still got so far to go. And that's not to discourage you, that's to encourage you. And the last one is going to be on giving. Giving, people always say, oh, here comes the money talk. Well, it's not just about our money. It's about everything that God has given us. Our time, our treasures, and our talents. You hear that from the pulpit over and over again. It's all that we are. And giving is another very important one because this shows who truly has ownership over our lives. It's my money, I'll give it. It's my time, I'll give it. These are my gifts and talents, I'll give it when I want to. Well, then we're holding on to them. We're declaring ownership for ourselves. So giving is another one of those spiritual disciplines where we say, God, it's all yours. You've given it to me however you want to use it. If you have a gift and a trade or something and you say, people are always bugging me just because I can fix a car. Well, that's a talent that God has given you. How are you using it for his glory? So it's not just about the money, but it's every aspect of our lives. How are we using this for God's glory? Now, all of this, to wrap it up, is not things that we are doing just to check the boxes. If we come in and we're one of those list person and we're going to say, okay, I'm doing this one now. I checked off this one. Today I did that one. Tomorrow I'm going to do that one. There, I'm done for the week. Well, then we miss the point completely because all of these spiritual disciplines is about getting us closer to God. Paul talks about love and he says, if I can do all these things, I can give my body to be burned. I can give all my stuff away. I can do all those things. But if I don't have love, I'm nothing. I'm just making noise in my life. And we can do the same thing. We can go through all these things. People can actually check all these boxes and say, there, I did it. And then they feel justified in it, but gotten no closer to God. So all these things we're doing out of a heart of worship. Each one of these should be a heart of worship. Now, this is what we're talking about, spiritual disciplines, introducing positive habits. But there's another side to this too. Spiritual discipline isn't just about let's do the right things. It's about removing the negative habits as well. We've talked today about habitual sin in our lives. Idleness, wasting time. Aaron talked about video games and how many hours people can spend on those things. Laziness. We just sit at home, we get home after work and it's like, I don't want to do anything else. I'm just going to veg in front of the TV, or I'm going to sit down in front of my video game, or I'm going to start scrolling through Reels and TikToks all night. We can waste hours and hours not getting anything done. Selfishness, greed, we can keep adding to these. Passivity was another one that was brought up. All these things add up to just pulling us away from our relationship with God. If we're going to be intentional, if we're going to be strategical about getting right with God, about growing that relationship, then we have to work on removing the bad habits as well as putting in the good ones. And it goes back to that example that Paul was giving about the athlete. He's going to have control over all areas of his life. And that's what we need to do too. We're going to have to take control over all areas of our life, getting rid of the bad habits and getting rid of and adding new ones. And if we can understand today, if we can walk away from this workshop, because we're going to get into a little bit about how habits are formed, trying to understand what it is that triggers in us these things and how we get into these ruts and see what we can do to remove them. If we can start to understand these things, well, then we can make the changes that we need to grow in all these areas. Now, let's be honest. If we've been Christians for any length of time, we probably tried to incorporate some of these things. I see a very good variegation of ages in here. There's some young people, there's some older people. For people who have been in the church for a long time and said, well, I'm gonna start praying more, and they're gonna put a plan in place and they're gonna start praying more, it kind of fails. It peters out. It doesn't get anywhere. We say, well, I'm going to read more. I'm gonna add more scriptures to my day. We might do okay for a little while and then it just falls off and we end up not doing anything. Or I'm going to be a spiritual leader in my home. I'm going to finally, be the head that God wants me to be. And I'm going to read to my kids and I'm going to pray with them. And I'm going to do these things with my wife. We're going to spend some time together in the Word. And that might go good for a week or two. And all of a sudden we get some pushback and all that goes by the wayside as well. We fail over and over again. I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, that I do. Again, the Apostle Paul in Romans 7 keeps going back and forth on his spiritual man versus his flesh and how they are always at war with one another. And to him at the time, if we read the whole conversation, it sounds like over and over again, his spiritual self wants to do the right thing. We want to do the right thing. We have great intentions, but our flesh is weak, and we end up doing the very things that we hate. So whether it's a positive thing in our life or whether it's a negative thing in our life, we have a hard time dealing with these things. We say, okay, I'm going to try again. I'm going to try again. And as we do these things, and we keep failing over time, we become more dejected, and it pushes away from trying to get the spiritual habit. The enemy is very smart. He knows how to do these things. But today we're going to try to be a little bit smarter. We're going to understand how we form habits in our lives and see if we can change a few of these things. Now, hopefully, again, a lot of good information today. I hope we still have a little bit of room upstairs so that we can get these in. I simplified this to be called the 3 R's of discipline. The things that we're going to do for practical application, introducing and removing habits in our lives. First R is going to be the reminder. Second is the response. And third is the reward. These are the 3 things that we're going to have to know in order to start changing the way we put discipline into our life. changing the way that we have habits in our lives. If I were going to put these in a diagram, it would look something like this. Up at the top, we would have the reminder. The reminder is the thing that tells us that it's an environmental cue of some sort that tells us that it's time to initiate whatever it is the discipline is. For example, phone rings. Well, there's an environmental cue. So we'll call that the trigger. Now, the second half of the reminder is going to be desire and the craving. That phone rings. What does it do? Well, all of a sudden, we're curious. We want to know who's calling. So now that's that desire and that craving. We have the environmental cue, phone's ringing. Now we have the desire, the craving. We want to know who's calling. That leads us to the next step. We're going to take action, and that's our response. The action in this case, well, we're going to answer the phone. That action is now going to satisfy what we were talking about at the beginning, is that desire. We wanted to know who was calling. Phone rings, there's a trigger. Now we want to know who's calling. That's our desire, our craving. Our action is we answer the phone. And our reward for that is now we have the satisfaction of knowing who's calling. Even though the chances are you probably already knew it was somebody trying to just clean your ear ducts, but now you know. I know it's been a few times that I'm sitting there at night and the phone's ringing. I'm going, I'm not going to answer it. I'm not going to answer it. I have to answer it, just in case. Hello? Yeah, no, I don't need my ear ducts cleaned. Thank you. But that's just the way it goes. So the reminder tells us to initiate the behavior. The response is the actual behavior that we want to perform. And the reward is what we receive for doing the behavior. Now, as this goes around, we start at the top again. We start to form this habit. We hear the phone ring again. Same thing happens. Our response is the same. Our benefit is the same. And as this repeats, and as the cycle repeats, and as the cycle repeats, for good or bad, whatever it is, it starts to become ingrained in us. After a while, it becomes something that's just automatic. It's things that we don't even think about. At first, it might be taking some work, some intentionality, if we're trying to break a bad habit or if we're trying to introduce a good habit. But over time, most of these things just can become automatic. Matter of fact, they say over 40% of our lives are spent doing things that are just automatic habits. You're hungry, you eat something. You're tired, you go to bed. You walk into a dark room and you can't say anything. What do? You turn on the light. So we see this cycle happening automatically throughout the day. Okay, it's a dark room. That's the trigger. And we can start picking these things out and just automatic habits that we do. Now I want to be able to see. Okay, that's the craving. I turn on the light. That is the response. And then I can see what's going on in the room. And that's the reward. That's the satisfaction of that. We get this going on in cycles, and some of them are so ingrained in us that if it's a bad habit we're trying to remove, it's going to take some very hard intentionality and strategic planning to be able to break these things at first. If it's something that we're trying to introduce, it may take a little bit of work at first. But we're going to take a closer look at these and more of a practical application. In our Tuesday night men's meetings, we've been looking at the book of James. James has a lot of practical information in it. It's kind of written more like Proverbs because there's so much information that just goes from one idea to the next. But one of the things he talks about is what I call the cycle of habitual sin in our lives. He breaks it down very, very clearly, and we're going to analyze this a bit. It starts a little bit later in verse 14, but I'm going to start in verse 13 just for context. James says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God himself cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. Sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death." Right here is what we call the cycle of sin. What's the trigger in this? Well, the temptation. That temptation could be many different things. Each of us has besetting sins in our lives, and we can pick one, we can go through and pick them all. But that temptation, whatever it may be, is what you're going to assert in that place. And that's what James's attention is here. What is a trigger? Temptation comes my way. What happens with it? Well, we're being enticed by our own evil desire. Our craving is that desire. We're tempted with something. It's something that we definitely want. What happens? We respond to it. Eventually, the conception and the birth of sin. We act on that. If you're viewing pornography, if you're spending time thinking about a certain girl, if you're thinking about stealing candy bars as a little kid, these things are ideas that become conceived in our mind, and we just play on them and play on them. Eventually, we're going to act out on them. Every act that we do is perceived by a thought. That thought, which in this case is our conception, is going to bring forth sin. And then that sin now brings forth the reward, in this case, death. Rewards aren't necessarily always good things. They can be consequences as well. Now, in this case, if we were to take sexual sin and put it this, and we'll do that a little bit closer in just a few minutes, your reward might be, okay, you get that release at that moment. But for Christians, what ends up happening after that when we get into the cycle of sin? The cycle of sin goes, well, then we end up going right back to the beginning again. But somewhere in here, right around this area here, we feel really, really bad about what we did. So what do? Well, we confess our sins. We grovel before God. You may promise that you're never going to do it again. Everything's going to change in your life. You're going to make some changes. And then the temptation comes again, and we start that cycle again. Why? Well, nothing's changed. That cycle is going to be the same thing. And the more that we do it, the more that becomes an automatic response to us. Have you ever wondered, in defeating sin, why Jesus was able to be tempted in all ways that we were, and yet without sin? I mean, that is an unfathomable amount of temptation. You take all the people in the world and all the different ways that we can be tempted by sin, Jesus was tempted in the same way, and yet he never gave in. Matter of fact, when he was at his weakest, whether it was in the garden or if it was when he was in the desert being tested for 40 days, Satan himself came and tried to tempt him. Satan himself, using scriptures, being as sly and as wry as he can be, a little fox that he is, tempted Jesus, and yet Jesus, there was nothing there. He didn't give it him a second. No second thoughts to any of these. Why was that? Well, because it's very simple. Jesus said that my desire is to do the will of my Father. See, we focus a lot of times when we get into the cycle of sin of what is that sin? Okay, we just came out of a session where Chris was talking about sexual sin in our lives. We focus on that sin and how we're going to defeat that sin. You're just going to sin again. Why? Because you're focusing on that sin. If we really want to change a habit in our lives, if we really want to change something, whether it's taking something bad out or adding something good in, the key is not focusing on the actual action that we want to do or the action that we want to remove. The key is to look at the craving, is to change that desire. See, if we have no desire for something, we're not going to be tempted to do it. Or if we have a strong desire for something, we're going to want to do it. In the cycle of sin, the reason Satan could never ever tempt Jesus was because his desire was to do the will of his Father. That was his main focus. If we have something that we're being tempted with that there's no ground in us, it's not going to go anywhere. If there's no motivation to do that action, to perform that temptation, then it's going to go nowhere. I'll give you an example. Some people know me well in here, some people don't. But some people think I'm a little bit on the cheap side. I get super upset if I lose a quarter in a vending machine. You are not going to tempt me to throw money into a slot machine. I don't care how many bells and whistles and flashing lights you give me, it just does nothing for me. I value that quarter far more than that. So tempt me all you want, it's not going to go anywhere. And in the same way, if we can focus on changing that craving in our life, if we can focus on what that desire is and get that to change in the direction we want, strategically think about it, be intentional about it, now we're going to change that action in our lives. And there's different ways that we can do this that will be beneficial, that we can kind of trick our minds into understanding, hey, this is something that I want to do. But we'll come back to that. Let's take a look at a few more practical examples. Here's kind of a neutral one. Your phone vibrates. Doesn't matter where you are. You could be at work. You could be walking down the street. You could be at home. What is it you want to do? You want to know what the message is. You want to know hey, I'm getting a notification for something. I want to know what's going on. That creates that desire. What is our response? We pick up our phone, we look at it. Oh, that's what it is. That's our reward. We now have the satisfaction of knowing what it is. It sounds very, very simplistic, but yet when we do this over and over and over again, that response becomes something very, very strong in us. Cell phones, even though this seems like it's a very neutral example, have become something that are actually quite dangerous in society. We've all seen the fail videos of people who just walking down the streets looking like this, walking into a pole, or they walk out into traffic, or they fall into a water fountain. I mean, how can you be that unaware that you got your phone down, you're facing a phone like this, that you're not looking even where you're going when you're walking? I saw one that somebody just fell right straight down a manhole. I don't know what the result of that one was. It looked funny at first, but I thought, man, that probably really hurt when they got to the bottom. It's getting to the point now, how strong this is in our lives, that people are driving while texting. Maybe we can add that to the list of pet peeves, but last night on my way home from the church, I'm going down the road and I'm going down almost a 90-degree turn in Essex. And all of a sudden a car comes flying out the other way, right into my lane, turns at the last second. The girl was sitting there going like this, texting. While driving down the road, trying to make a turn. I mean, okay, we're texting, we're steering with our elbows or our wrists. We got the gas pedal down here. Our left foot's open. Why don't we put a controller down there? Maybe we can add a video game too. How much more distraction can we need? But the thing is this is how these patterns are formed in our lives. We did this a few times. We wanted to know what it is. We got that reward. Oh, so-and-so was texting me. That's kind of cool. Oh, that was a funny meme. Oh, I like what they just posted. Or some people post really good memes. You enjoy them. You want to see these things, right? But the thing is as this becomes a routine in our lives, we can get ourselves into situations where we're no longer in control, but these things are now controlling us because they've become automatic. Let's take a look at a negative one. We all have triggers for habitual sin. Stress is often one of them. We get in a fight, we're having problems at work, relationships aren't going well, or finances are difficult. Whatever it is, these stresses can be, okay, I want relief from this. Could be anxiety. For some people, it could be boredom. People talk about, especially if they're people who are trying to do dieting, they try and find the root cause of why they're eating. It's just because they're bored. They have nothing better to do, and that becomes the response to it. Whatever that stimulus is for us, we have to know ourselves, and this is where we got to do a little bit of homework and examine ourselves to see, okay, what is my trigger in these situations? What does it lead to? You want to escape. You're in a stressful situation. You're bored. You have nothing to do. You had a fight with somebody. These become a trigger. Now you want relief from that. So what does it do? In our minds, we turn that to, it could be sexual gratification. It could be any besetting sin that you have. Take a pick of what is happening in your own life. Know yourself. But what happens is when we get that sexual craving, we act on it now. In some way, shape, or form, you're going to view pornography, or you're going to let your imagination go wild, and you're going to search for that dopamine relief. Now, remember I said that sometimes our rewards can be consequences. In this case, we still get a positive reward for it. That positive reward is what's building that habit. The dopamine relief we get is taking away that stress for a little bit. It's taken away that anxiety for a little bit. It's taken away that boredom for a little bit. It's given us something to do. And now we've just reinforced that every time I'm stressed, every time I'm bored, every time I get in a fight with my wife or my significant other, this is the step that I take to get relief from that. As we form that cycle over and over again, I don't care how much you want to focus on, I'm not going to view pornography, you're going to fail because the root of it is still there, as Chris was saying, We have to deal with the root. Let's take a look at a positive one. Here's a gentleman who's been doing this for years. His trigger, it's an environmental cue. His morning alarm clock goes off. His craving, he wants to read his Bible and have a coffee. Remember that and have a coffee part. There's an important key to that. There's a pro tip, if you will, we'll get to. So what does he do? Well, he's got a thing set up where he wants to do is read the Bible through the year. So he takes the scriptures for that day, sits down with his cup of coffee, he sits down with his Bible, he reads through his scriptures for the day, and he's ready to go. What's his reward? If you're at the point where this is an automatic thing, it's not something that has to be really big. We don't need some kind of big release. We don't need some great prize at that time, because this has become something that's automatic in your life. It's something you're just going to enjoy. Matter of fact, you get people who will do things, whether it's runners, they get that, what they call the runner's high, or people who go to the gym all the time. When you do these things that are constant in your life and they become automatic, when you get to that point where they're automatic, you're actually going to miss it if you don't do it. If a runner gets an injury and all of a sudden he can't run, it just puts him into a tailspin. If you can't go to the gym and you're used to doing that, it just puts you into a tailspin. Why? Because all of a sudden you're craving this normality, this function of your life, this automatic thing that you do is now gone. But it takes a little bit of while to get there. So what are some of the things that we can do? Well, it's not necessarily going to be easy at first, because like I say, some of these disciplines, some of these habits that we have formed in our lives have been there for a long time. And they are at that stage where they have become automatic. One of the things we can do is, again, know that we got to focus on where the craving is, not the actual activity. Okay, we can pick an activity. That's the activity we want to do, but it's the craving that's going to be the motivation for us to do it. In this case, we're going to try and redirect those things. And again, we're going to get back into that a little bit more, but in the middle example, now I have stress in my life. Now I have anxiety, boredom, whatever it is that we're facing. I'm going to now try to redirect that craving towards something else. That's not going to be easy at first. On this graphic, I don't know how easy it is to read for you, but it says effort relative to the rewards over time. Whenever we start to introduce a new discipline, whenever we try to introduce a new habit into our lives, it's going to take a lot of effort at first. We're going to say, you know what? I don't feel like getting out of bed to read my Bible this morning. I don't feel like getting out of bed to do exercise. I don't feel like doing this thing because that's not my habit. It's going to take a lot of effort. That effort level at the first is going to be a 10. Your reward for that is going to be near 0. Over time, as we get into the habit of continuing these things, those lines will slowly change. Where, okay, after we've done this in that time period is relative. It can be different for everybody. I got 60 some odd days here because they say that's what it takes to form a habit. It could be more, it could be less, depends on the habit itself. But the idea is that as we continue to do these things over time, that effort becomes less because it's becoming more of a habit in our life. And yet what we're receiving for it is getting higher and higher. That does change, but we have to have patience. As the Bible says, do not grow weary while doing good, for in due season you will reap if you do not lose heart. So let's take a quicker look at each one of these R's. The reminder says the trigger, which is your cue to initiate a certain behavior. This is what is going to set everything off for us. There's things that we can do in our lives. Sometimes we say these are natural cues. If we're talking about stress or anxiety, these can be a natural truth. Some of these can be environmental cues, as we were talking about cell phone buzzing or ringing, an alarm clock going off. These cues themselves is what's going to tell you, okay, it's time to get your butt in gear. We're going to do this behavior. And there's a hierarchy of what will work for them. You have to know yourself. Time and trial and error will tell you what works best for you. But here are some things that you'll find in the pyramid that'll work and won't work. Sheer willpower. The idea that you're going to just do it on your own. I'm going to change my mind and I'm going to just go for it. I'm going to get out of bed early and I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to do this. Or After dinner, I'm going to take out the devotional. We're going to read it with the kids. Whatever activity it is that you want to do, you need a trigger that's going to set that off. Willpower itself is a very poor one for the most part. And I say that for a reason. Sometimes willpower can become the strongest thing in a negative sense. When the consequences for our sin get to a certain point where we reach rock bottom, Chris was talking about your sin will find you out. When people get exposed, all of a sudden that willpower goes up because they don't want to face that consequence again. That's not a good place to be. We want to change things before we get to that. My father, he's an amazing man. Some people may know him. He was a director for the detox centers in Windsor. He took care of all addictions in Windsor, Essex County. He stood on the board on Brentwood. But what a lot of people don't know about him is the story before that, is that he was an alcoholic while I was growing up. My parents separated when I was in grade 3. My dad had an extremely successful job in the States. He worked for a big computer company. He made a lot of money. He had a lot of prestige with that, but he drank a lot. And it would get to the point where every once in a while he'd go on these binges and we don't even know where he is for days. Well, one summer, when I was about 12 years old, he went on a binge for about 2 weeks. We had no idea where he was, what he was doing, even if he was alive or dead. Nobody had heard from him. Lost his job in the States during that time because they had had enough. But even bigger than that, he missed my sister's wedding. I had to walk my sister down the aisle at 12 years old because my father was out on a binge. He came to himself after that and obviously turned his life around. And through sheer willpower, realizing that those consequences were so severe, he could not get that time back. He never wanted to go through that again. He had enough willpower to change. We don't want to get to that. These can be strong things in our lives, but we want to get to the point where we can put these disciplines in place to stop ourselves before we hit our rock bottom. The next thing is an environmental cue. A lot of people have cell phones. If you want to do some exercise, and you can put all kinds of apps on there, what are they going to do? They're going to give you a notification. Hey, time to do exercise. You can set an alarm. Your alarm goes off. Hey, it's time to read my Bible. Any type of environmental cue it is. For some time, I knew a guy who, at work, he really didn't eat his lunch. He would just wait for the lunch bell to go off, and then he would go find a quiet spot in the plant, and that was his time to be alone with the Lord and pray. The environmental cue in that was the break time. So it's something that's happening in our environment that's telling us it's time to initiate that behavior. An even better way to do it is to attach it to a habit that you already have. I mentioned to you the idea of that coffee earlier. That was very important, and that was one of the keys to me. I love coffee. I really like coffee. I get up in the morning. Before I do anything, I walk over to the coffee maker. I do that. I do that before I go to the bathroom. I do that before I practically open my eyes. But if I can attach something to that, when that cue goes off, I really want that coffee. If I can add to it, I want to read my Bible at the same time. Now I'm taking a habit that I already have and attaching something else to it. I have more chance of success of doing this. So if I can take one of these positive disciplines and say, this is going to be my time of prayer when I get home from work. This is going to be time for prayer when my alarm goes off in the morning. This is going to be my time for prayer when whatever it is that you're doing on a regular basis, any habit that you know that you can attach it to, you're going to have a much better chance of doing these things. Because each time you do that, you're going to say, oh yeah, I'm going to get a coffee and grab my Bible. Oh yeah, lunch bell goes off, and I like to go for a walk. I'm going to take that time to pray. Some people like to go for a run in the mornings. They go for a run. That becomes, I'm going to go for a run and I'm going to take time to worship the Lord. So if we can attach these spiritual disciplines to habits that we already have, we have a much better chance of being successful in it. And I'm going to put at the top of this, partner in accountability. A natural example for this is going to the gym. People, especially if they haven't exercised before or haven't done it in a long time and they want to try and put this into their lives, it is so easy to blow off going to the gym if you're just going to go alone. But if you're meeting somebody there, all right, just for their sake, it sets up that accountability. And we can set up accountability counters if they're going to walk through it with us, if we're going to do this together, those accountability partners can help us a lot in getting this success. The next R is going to be response, the actual discipline that you want to perform or eliminate. How we perceive a habit is going to be important on whether we're successful at doing it or not. If we perceive this as being something large and insurmountable, our chances of success are going to be very, very low. If we think of it as something smaller that we can do and have success at, our chances of doing it are going to be a lot higher. So when we're trying to pick something that we're going to do, we need it to be realistic and achievable. I mean, if you're 5 feet tall, you've never dribbled a basketball, and you're saying, my goal is to be on the Olympic basketball team, okay, that's probably not going to happen. Same way as if you've never really gotten into spiritual disciplines before, and you say, I'm going to wake up 2 hours early, I'm going to spend an hour in the Word, I'm going to spend an hour in prayer, and I'm going to do this every single day, your goal is probably a little bit too high. Let's start smaller. If you've ever heard of the 1% rule, it actually really applies well in this. And that's taking whatever your ultimate goal is and making small incremental changes over time. Again, this is where we can be strategic. If somebody's goal, for example, is to lose 100 pounds, they may say, 100 pounds, man, that is a big number. That is going to be so hard to do, and it'll seem so overwhelming for them, they're never going to do it. But what if instead of that, they say, you know what? I'm going to make a goal. I'm going to forget about the 100 pounds. I'm going to lose 5 pounds. I can lose 5 pounds. And they put the effort in, and within a couple of weeks, hey, I lost that 5 pounds. That wasn't so bad. You know, I made a few small changes. I'm going to do that again. A few more weeks from now, I'm going to try to lose 5 more pounds. A few more weeks goes by, they succeed. They get a reward, and they're like, hey, I can do this. This time I'm going to put it up to 10 pounds. And then next time, 15 pounds. And then maybe 20 pounds. Before you know it, they've reached that 100-pound goal. But they've done it in small incremental steps. And what ends up happening is in the 1% rule is when we take these small incremental improvements each day, this one here I plugged into a PowerPoint, just 1% a day over the period of a year means a 3,700% improvement in whatever it is that we're trying to do. That seems huge. Okay, let's half that. That's still monumental compared to doing nothing at all. And for those who have been maybe complacent and doing the same thing over and over again, the other side of this is true too. Because if we start doing the same thing over and over again, or we start letting it slide a little bit, that 1% rule on the bottom line, the red line, moves very, very little. And we become the proverbial frog in the frying pan, where they turn up the heat a little bit, and before you know it, all these things that seem completely unrelated are going topsy-turvy. You got fights with your spouse. You got problems at work. You're in turmoil all the time. You're being affected by stress. You're going, what is going on? I'm still reading my verse of the day. I'm still doing this. But we haven't improved, and we've let those things slide. And the opposite ends up happening. But the encouraging thing is that even with these small incremental changes, that end goal may seem like it'll take forever to get there, but it happens a lot quicker than we think. One of the benefits of the spiritual disciplines is on this side of it, is that it's one of those things that will benefit you across the board. We talk about some habits that maybe have multiple benefits to you. Maybe you're thinking, you know, I want to have better prospects in dating, so I'm going to hit the gym and I'm going to start looking a little bit better, and that's your goal. All of a sudden, you start feeling better. You start having more energy. You lose some weight. You're more confident in yourself. All these things start to benefit you. These are rewards that you weren't even expecting. Well, with the spiritual disciplines, these happen in all areas of our lives. If we can focus on the spiritual disciplines themselves, we're going to end up increasing in our physical, our mental, and our spiritual side, our relationships, our work habits, the stresses that we find in our lives. Adam was sharing earlier about doing Christian counseling, and all Christian counselors will tell you the same thing. It doesn't matter if they're dealing with a relationship issue. It doesn't matter if you've got a habitual sin habit in your life. It doesn't matter what kind of stresses you're dealing with. 100% of the guys have this common denominator. They're not moving forward in any of these spiritual disciplines. If we can start moving forward in these spiritual disciplines, all of a sudden, all these other problems we have start to just kind of work themselves out. They become diminished. Why? Because we're moving closer to God. Jesus said, my will is to do the will of the Father. His desire was to please the Father. And as we become more Christ-like in our walk, when we're taking intentional steps to get closer to God through these spiritual disciplines, we're growing closer to God. All of a sudden, all these other problems, although they may not go away, they become less and less and less because our desire and our focus becomes more on God. And even though we go through hard times, Adam was sharing with you, we went through some very hard times in the last few years. If you're staying close to God, you're saying, okay, God, you got this. You're going to bring me through this. Where do we go from here? And all these stressors, all these plans that we had, we just throw them all aside and focus solely on God. And these things will start to change us in ways we can't even comprehend. Aaron said, if there's one thing that I want you to take away today, well, in this workshop, if there's one thing I want you to take away today is this, is that if we can focus on even improving one of these areas in these spiritual disciplines, all those negative habits, all the bad things are going to be diminished. We're going to be able to start taking care of those things without even having to put effort into them. That would be the one thing. The next thing is the final R, which is the reward, the stimulus that is received for attaining the desired response. What do we get for doing it? What's our benefit? It's a proverbial carrot and the stick. If we're going to try and convince ourselves to do these things, we need to have a reward at the end of it that's desirable enough. That carrot has to be big enough. If we don't desire that reward, if it's a small reward, we're not going to want it. If the stick is too long, if it's too far away, if we're setting too high goals, we're not going to attain it. So we have to know what it is that is going to motivate us to get into the habits that we want to do. If you're here and you're thinking, well, my wife wants me to do this, or my mom's getting on my case, or I know that it's probably something I shouldn't be doing. These are all things that are going to be destined to fail. You may think, well, I should be strong enough to do these on my own. Again, we get into that lie that Chris was talking about. We're not strong enough to do it on our own. We need the Holy Spirit. We need some kind of encouragement. And sometimes, even at the beginning of trying to form these disciplines, we need something a little bit extra, some kind of reward that's going to get us to there. When I was doing it's called the Body for Life. It was an exercise program I was doing with my brother-in-law years ago. He had a hard time with how stringent that diet was. Very hard time, to the point where he was going to quit after just a few days because of all the things he wanted to eat. So what we did was we put a cheat day in. One day a week, we can eat whatever we want. So for him, whenever he had one of those cravings, he would put those cheat days in. And his reward for following the diet all week was he's going to eat everything that he wanted throughout the week on that cheat day. So we did that. I mean, the first day he did that, he got extremely sick. But that was his reward for being faithful through that. What we want to do in our lives is we want to create the habit and optimize it later. Related to this, get yourself to the gym. Who cares if you're not doing all the exercises correctly? Maybe you're not doing the order right. Just get yourself into the habit of getting to the gym. And then over time, okay, now we're going to tweak it, and now we're going to improve it until that program starts to, okay, now I know I should be separating these muscle groups. Now I know I should be doing this. We can do that in our spiritual disciplines too. Start getting into that habit. Start reading your word. Get that habit into our lives, and then we can optimize it later. The next step is going to be taking a look at that worksheet you have. I want to walk you through one of these real quick. We're running way out of time here. On your sheet, it tells you the top, the spiritual disciplines. You're going to take one of those. This is something that's going to be personal. We're not going to break off into groups. Something I want you to think about yourself. Which one of these do you think you need the most in your life? You're going to pick one of those. Step one is you're going to decide what that discipline is, what your response is going to be. For example, I might pick Bible reading as mine. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to read our daily bread every day. That's what my goal is going to be. So we write down what that is. We're going to decide what our trigger is. Again, going back to my example, I'm going to wake up and make coffee. That's what my trigger is. So the desire is I'm going to read that devotional with that coffee. What's my reward going to be for that? Now, again, at the beginning, my reward is not an automatic response. It's something that I need to encourage me. Well, I'm going to say my reward for this is going to be 2 weeks from now, if I can do this every single day, I'm going to buy myself a bag of premium coffee. That's what really motivates me. And then underneath that, we're going to take it and write it out. So I'm going to write out for the next 2 weeks, when I wake up in the morning, I'm going to read the Our Daily Bread devotional each morning while having my coffee. And if I succeed, I'm going to buy a couple pounds of Bog's premium coffee. Shameless plug there. If we can understand this and we can make those goals small, then we can build off of that and increase from there. One last quick thing I want to leave you with, because I'm way over time now, is the obstacle of failure. When we start these things, it's going to take some time, some intentionality, some strategic planning, and getting to know, trial and error, what motivates us. But we got to remember that in Psalms, it says that the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. He delights in his way, and though he may fail, he shall not be utterly cast down, for the Lord upholds him with his hand. God can help us through these. The Holy Spirit can help us work ourselves through these. If we find that we fail, there's different areas where we're going to fail. If the problem was we eliminated the trigger, our discipline is not going to start, we reduce our desire, well, then we're not going to have motivation to do it. If the response is too difficult or too large, we're going to be unable to achieve it. If we have an unsatisfactory reward, we're going to lose the desire to repeat it. So take a look at each one of these areas that we talked about today on that paper. If there's an area where you found this didn't work out, okay, let's go back, re-examine it. They say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Change it up, try it again, focus on that craving, and we'll get to the place where we finally get to the process is the goal and not perfection. Amen? Let's close with a quick prayer. Father, we thank you for this opportunity we had to have a workshop here today. I ask, Lord, that you would just, again, there's lots of information that came out. Help us to compartmentalize it, to be able to walk away with something, to be able to apply it to our lives. So that, Lord, when we walk out of here, we're not just saying, hey, that was good, and I'm going to go home and change nothing about my life. But, Father, that it would be something that we'd be encouraged about, something we would look forward to, and that you give each and every person here the wisdom on how to make these changes. One step at a time, Lord, and all for your glory. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.